we'll be proceeding to module 2, which is Introduction to CSS. So during the last week, we've been able to cover the basics and the most important aspect of HTML. But in this module, we'll be seeing how we can style our HTML files into a nice looking website. So let's get into it. So first off, we're going to know and get used to what CSS is all about. CSS is a language that you use to describe how an HTML document is written, especially in form of stylings. But to put it in a more simpler term, you can say CSS is used to style and lay out your web page. Okay, CSS helps you to alter fonts, color, size, and even spacing of your content. It also helps you to add decorative features to your document. So CSS fully means cascading style sheet, and this literally means that it allows multiple styling of a single HTML document, but just so in the order of importance. For example, if there are multiple style sheets controlling a particular HTML document, CSS will take note of the important styling and apply it to the HTML. This will be fully explained when we talk about CSS specificity, but that is what cascading means. And that is the major rule that guides CSS generally. So the next thing we're going to be talking about is the general CSS syntax. A CSS code should contain a selector and a declaration group. And this declaration group should be a key value pair of a property and a value. Now, depending on the type of styling you want to give your element or content, the property that you choose and the value you give it will determine how well it will come out. So sometimes you can achieve similar results using different properties or approach. So you get to decide how you want to lay out your style, but it's best to plan ahead before beginning to style. Also note that there should always be a colon after your property and a semicolon to close the whole declaration. In this syntax, the CSS selectors most likely point or reference elements, IDs, or a particular content that you want to style. The property are usually the type of styling you want to give your selector. For example, colors, margins, borders, backgrounds, and all of that. Those are properties. Now, values are what determines the type of property you're giving this content. Values range depending on the type of property you're talking about. For colors, you have color names that determine the color property. For borders, you have units that will determine the size, the width, the height of the border. So this works hand in hand together to give your HTML its stylings. Now let's talk about CSS selectors. CSS selectors help us reference a particular content that we want to style in CSS. And we have different types of selectors. We have the simple selectors, which are usually classes, IDs, elements. Classes selectors are represented with the dot mark. For example, you just say dot the name of the class, then you begin to style. IDs are represented with hash, the hash sign, then the name of the ID, then you style. Elements do not require any symbol, you just style it after declaring the name and you style. The next type of selector is combinator selector, and this allows you to combine two or more simple selectors to get one selector, okay? And this is done by using combinator signs. Now, the type of combinator sign that you use will determine the relationship between the two simple selectors. Now, what do I mean? For example, if you want to reference the descendants, or let's say yeah, a child of a particular parent element, there's a way you can combine the parent elements and the child to reference that particular child. Now, the combinator selector are of different types. We have four different types of combinator selector. The first one is descendant selector. That is, any descendant of that parent element can be referenced using that symbol, and it is represented by space. Okay, if you have a particular parent element, whatever comes or is nested inside that parent element can be referenced using the descendant selector, and which is space. Okay, the next one is child selector. This selects the children of a particular parent element. This is represented by the greater sign symbol. So if you're going to reference any child of a particular parent element, you can declare the name of that element, use the greater sign symbol, and reference the child of that parent. That way you have a child combinator selector. The next one is the adjacent selector. Now, the adjacent selector targets the adjacent sibling, that is the sibling immediately after a particular element, and this is represented by the plus sign. Okay, we also have the general sibling selector. So far it's a sibling of that element, you can reference it using this particular selector, and it is represented with this wavy hyphen sign. That's how you reference any general sibling. The next selector is the pseudo class selector, and it is used to define a special state of an element. Just like the name implies, false classes, pseudo class, that is a false class. The class is not there, but you kind of create it for the sake of the styling. They are not classes and they are not originally attached to an element, but you can attach them after a particular action is done. For example, when you move your mouse over an element, it is called hovering. Now there's a hover pseudo class that it will be attached to that element whenever this action is done. You can now style this particular pseudo class for when this action occurs. That's the function of pseudo class selectors, and we have a lot of them, like the over, the active, visited. This particular selector are mostly used on links and are represented with the use of one colon, single colon, the single colon before the pseudo class, and you can style. The next selector we'll be looking at is the pseudo element selectors. Pseudo element, not pseudo class. This is false element now, not false class. Just the same way the pseudo class was explained, this is a false element. It is not an original element. It is, you will not find it. You will not originally find it in your HTML file, but it is created just for the sake of styling. Example of this pseudo element is before and after. You use this in cases where you want to style a particular element, but you need a sort of element to style that particular element. So you can place a pseudo element before or after that particular element to style. This particular selector is represented with two colons before the pseudo element. That's how you recognize pseudo elements. When you see two colons before them, before they are styled, you recognize it to be a pseudo element selector. Now, the final type of selector we'll be talking about is the universal selector. This universal selector is represented with asterisk, the star sign. This particular selector targets all of the elements inside a particular HTML document, all from beginning to the end. So whatever styling you give to this universal selector affects all of the elements in a particular document. So I just want you to put all of this at the back of your mind so that when we begin the coding session, these terms do not sound foreign to you. Okay. So the next important thing we're going to be talking about is the CSS units. CSS units determine the size or the extent of a value that is given to a property you're trying to set for an element or its content. Now, for example, let's take the width property for an example. If you give a particular width 20 pixel, the type of unit that you give that value is what determines the extent of the property. If we decide to change the unit from pixel to percentage, there will be a change in the size of the property we're trying to target. It is important to know what unit is best to use when you're styling a project. So in CSS, there are various types of units that we use, but they are majorly categorized into the absolute units and relative units. Now, the absolute units are usually the same size regardless of the parent element or window size. I usually regard them as the rigid elements. No matter what device you're using to view them, they do not change in style. So they are very bad for responsive styling. Okay, example of this type of units are the pixels, the centimeters, inches, and so on. They have situations where they are best put to use, but when it comes to responsiveness, they are not advisable. Next one is the absolute units. Sorry, the relative units. Okay, the relative units are useful for responsive stylings because they scale relative to your parent, to the parent or window size. Example of these relative units are the M's, the rems, the percentages, view width, view height, and all. Now, M's are dependent on the font size of a particular element. For example, if you give a particular element um 4 pixel and you style another property using M's, it's whatever value you give that particular property at that time is relative to the font size that you've given the parent element of that element. These things will become clearer when we begin to do the when we begin to practicalize all of these things and we use them in our codes. Okay, the next relative unit that we'll be looking at is the rem. Rem is dependent on the root element of the document. You know, ems, rems, roots, ems. Okay, and the root element of a particular HTML document is the HTML tag itself. Originally, the font size of the HTML is 16 pixel, and whatever value in rems that you use, it will be relative to 16 pixel, except you alter the font size of your HTML element, it will always be relative to 16 pixel. Now, percentages are dependent of the value of the parent element. For example, if the parent element is 100% and you give a child of the parent 50%, it will only take 50% of the 100% of the parent. It will only take half of the 100% of that parent. That's why we say it is dependent on the parent element, just like M's. Okay. The next one is the view width and the view height. They are dependent on window sizes. View width, that is, if you say if you divide the width of a particular window size into 100 cards, if you take out 20 view width, it will take 20% of the whole 100 cards. So that is why you say it is relative or dependent on the device, on the window size of the device you're working with. The same thing with the height. It's just imagine it is divided into 100 sections. The particular amount of view height that you choose to give a particular element would be relative to the size, to the height or the width of a window element. These are the major CSS units you'll be most likely working with in CSS. even though there are still more, but these are like the most important ones that you should look into. So the next thing we'll be looking into is the CSS colors. There are different ways we can declare color values in CSS. We have different methods ranging from using regular color names, just say, okay, property color equals color blue, and that works. You can also use red, green, blue. There are values that you give this RGB that determines a particular color. For example, the example that we have here, the same color blue that I declared using the normal color name can be declared using this RGB sequence, the 00255, also leads to color blue. Depends on what color code you are trying to get, because color names can be limiting. There are some colors that you do not necessarily know their names, but you can derive them using codes. The same with hexadecimals, they are good in such cases where you do not really know the names of the color that you want to use, or perhaps the designer gives you color codes. Most of the time designers do not give you color codes in names, they give you in X, hexadecimals, HSLs, or RGB. That's why it is important to know these color codes as well. Also, there's a way you can manipulate the opacity of a particular color using the RGB and the HSL. The RGB becomes RGBA, that's RGB plus the alpha perimeter. Yeah, it's called alpha perimeter. Alpha perimeter ranges from 0 to 1. So depending on how opaque or how transparent you want a particular color to look, you would use the 0 to 1 range to determine this. You can look up codes for different colors of your choice, or when you're working with a project, you can always use the color wheel to get color codes for RGB, hexadecimals, and HSLs. The last important topic we'll be looking into in CSS before we go into the coding session fully is CSS specificity. Now, specificity is the means by which browsers decide which CSS property values are the most relevant to an element and therefore will be applied. That is, the one that seem to be stronger or is strongest based on the amount of competitors will be applied. Okay, so when two or more styles of the same property target a particular element, the style with the highest specificity is the one that gets applied. Now, the specificity of a style is dependent on where the selector ranks compared to its conflicting selectors. Based on this hierarchy, the inline styling is the strongest, as we can see on the charts that we have on our screens. Inline stylings are the strongest, followed by ID selectors. Then we have the classes, the attributes, pseudo classes, before we have the elements and pseudo elements. So ranging from inline styles down to elements and pseudo elements, we have the highest specificity ranks to the lowest specificity ranks. Now, in cases where you use the same selectors but different styles, the most recent style wins. That is, if you use a particular element on top, let's say you say H4, color is blue. Then under it, you decide to use that same H4 and say color is red or green. Let's say green. CSS rule will choose the most recent declaration over the one above it. So the one below will be applied. That is if you use the same selector but different styles. Now there's an exceptional rule that overrides all of this hierarchy. That's the important keyword. It is represented with the exclamation mark, then important. Okay, the important keyword is mostly used as a last resort. It is like used in a last ditch attempt to win over CSS specificity wars when all else fails. For example, we don't know where a particular style is coming from, and it's overriding your styles, and you feel like okay, you've done all you can, but it's not working. You can use the important keyword to override or reset all of the previous stylings. So um whatever declaration you put the important keyword, that one will be taking over the others. The important keyword is not to be used often. It is supposed to be used as last resort. Please note that you shouldn't use the important keyword too much. You should use it only when necessary. Okay. So this is the end of this session, and we'll be getting into the coding session right about now. Thank you for sticking around. See you guys.